This Saturday night in the ViStar Arena in Jacksonville, Florida, one of the most unique events in the history of mixed martial arts goes down as UFC 249 finally happens. This card was due to take place on April 18th in Brooklyn, New York, but it's been changed. The coronavirus has hit and everything has been moved around. And this show is Let the Record Show. So we're going to talk about the records. We're going to talk about the card. There'll be no talk about viruses here, nothing like that. If you want that, the SevereMMA podcast, myself and Graham discussed it at length on that in the weekend and on previous podcasts as well. And I'm sure on other things as well over on Patreon, patreon.com/SevereMMA podcast if you want to sign up there. But this is going to be a look at the records, a deep dive in the records, a look at the fights on the card, who's fighting who, and how it all lines up. So let's get straight into it. And what I always do on this show, if you've never seen it before, the first thing I always do is the Wikipedia test. So here's the Wikipedia test for UFC 249, the new look UFC 249, and it's very good. As we see here, the only person without a blue name is Yorgan De Castro, who's fighting Greg Hardy. So everyone else, every other fighter on the card has a blue name on Wikipedia, which is a very, very good, very, very good sign. So it's a good card from top to bottom. We're going to get into all the fights and all the fighters and everything like that, but it's a very, very good card. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to head on over to Tapology and take a deeper look at the card itself and at the fighters on the card. So as I mentioned, this fight is going to be going down at the ViStar Veterans Memorial Arena in Jacksonville, Florida, this Saturday night. It's on pay-per-view on in the US, and it's on BT Sports 1 here in Ireland and the UK. Obviously, because of the coronavirus, there will be no fans in the arena. So, as I mentioned, a very, very unique event. Something which even with the Ultimate Fighter we haven't really seen. So it'll be interesting to see how that works and how that plays out on the night. So let's go down and look through the card first. And I think it's, probably benefit us just have a look at all the fights first. And then we'll do a deeper dive on everything else. So with Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje, Henry Cejudo versus Dominick Cruz, Francis Ngannou versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik, Jeremy Stephens versus Calvin Kattar, Greg Hardy versus Yorgan De Castro, Donald Cowboy Cerrone versus Anthony Pettis, Fabricio Werdum versus Alexi Olynyk, Carla Esparza versus Michelle Waterson, Ronaldo Jacare Souza versus Uriah Hall, Vicente Luque versus Nico Price, Charles Rosa versus Bryce Mitchell, and Ryan Spann versus smiling Sam Alvey. So the first thing I want to do is I want to look at the main event. I feel like this main event is an absolutely fantastic fight, and it really should be getting more of a shine maybe, and because of the circumstances around the card and Khabib Nurmagomedov having been supposed to fight Tony Ferguson so many times, and on this card as well, it feels like maybe this fight isn't being appreciated as much maybe as it should. So let's take a look at both fighters on the card. First of all, it's going to be for the 155-pound interim lightweight title over 5-minute rounds with Tony Ferguson, who is 25-3 in his career, Justin Gaethje 21-2. So let's look at Tony Ferguson first. The man, the previous interim champion, as I mentioned, 25-3. He has current 12-fight win streak, which is absolutely huge in the lightweight division, the best division in MMA. To have 12 fights in a row is unprecedented, really. It's absolutely brilliant. Well, at the top level anyway. I know Khabib has a lot as well, but most of those aren't at the top level. So Tony Ferguson has been doing it for a very long time. A lot of good wins in those 12 fights, which we will see. 36 years of age, I think that's an interesting thing as well for Tony Ferguson. He's been around a good bit. He's had lots of fights. How long, will he will he be able to keep going like that at that age as well? That's an interesting thing as well. Fighting out of California, so obviously, traveling down to Florida, he's already there at the recording of this, so that's maybe one less worry for a person in this sort of situation. So let's look at his recent fights. Obviously, he was supposed to fight Justin Gaethje a couple of weeks ago, and that's been moved to now. Then Khabib a couple of weeks before that. So this fight is happening this weekend. So previous to that, he entered a fight with Donald Cerrone at 24-3, now 25-3. Obviously, Cerrone with lots of fights in that on his record as well. So lots of experience there going into that one. And he won via eye injury. He closed up Cerrone's eye. I remember Cerrone like blew out his eye, so he was able to win that one. Before that, it was Anthony Pettis. Obviously, his last two opponents both fight each other this weekend. Another injury, broken hand, a corner stoppage at the end of the second round. Again, win for Tony Ferguson. Before that, I cancelled Khabib Nurmagomedov bout. Kevin Lee, who dominated him for some of that fight and won by a triangle. Then another cancelled Khabib Nurmagomedov bout, and then a unanimous decision win over Rafael dos Anjos. And those few fights there, that shows you a lot. So you have a decision win in a kind of a technical clinic, maybe. You have a cancelled Khabib fight. You have a triangle choke win after getting, having a tough fight, getting beaten up. Well, maybe not beaten up, but getting more than probably he wanted. Then Khabib fight that was cancelled. Then you have two doctor stoppages after ferocious beatings. Then another Khabib cancelled fight. So this is really the story of Tony Ferguson recently, just beating people up and having cancelled Khabib Nurmagomedov fights. Before that was Lando Venata on short notice. And before that, 3 cancelled bout Michael Chiesa, Khabib Nurmagomedov, and Michael Johnson. He beat Edson Barboza before that in another fantastic fight. Another cancelled Khabib fight. There seems to be a lot of them. Then Josh Thompson, Gleison Tibau, Abel Trujillo. And this was kind of the time when Tony Ferguson started to come into his own, started to get towards the best people in the division. Abel Trujillo at the time was a good fighter on his way up into that at 12-5. Gleison Tibau, we know, has been around for a long time. And Josh Thompson, a former champion over in Strikeforce and other places as well. So back in 2015. So this is 5 years Tony Ferguson has really been on the road to the very, very top. And he's been doing very good things. Now he's obviously, before that he was doing it as well. Beat Danny Castillo as a very good fighter, and we see other guys here as well. But his last loss, we look back here in 2012. And he only had, 1, 2, 3, 4 fights in the next, 2.5 years. So that's not a lot. It's a good transition, I suppose, to get to where he's gotten to today. But after that loss, he's really come back strong. Lost to Michael Johnson, obviously. Before that, he beat the likes of Eve Edwards, some good names there, like Ramsey Nijem. He was in the Tough House before that, and then we see all his fights earlier on in his career. So he beat Joe Schilling as well earlier in his career. So let me just look here at how his fights have finished. So his wins: 14 by a KO TKO, 9 by submission, 5 by decision. So I think that 14 by KO TKO is a good one to look at, because a lot of people, again, when Tony's fighting Khabib, they expect him to maybe get the submission, but you see Tony has power, he has good technical striking as well, but he has the ability to go long and finish guys that way, give kind of a prolonged beating, and we see all the submissions as well. We know what he's like on the ground, and his losses then 3 by decision and 1 by submission, so never been knocked out, and that's I think most people picking Justin Gaethje are picking him to win. So let's jump over here to Justin Gaethje and see his record. And maybe what we'll do before going through Gaethje's record is look at what we just looked at for Tony Ferguson. So his wins have become 17 by knockout, 2 by submission, and 2 by decision. So that tells you a lot about Justin Gaethje. His wins are knockout wins. Almost all of them are knockout wins. 17 and 4 by other ways of winning. So that's huge for him. And his losses, 2 by KO, TKO. So that tells you really the story about Justin Gaethje before we get into anything else. So let's look at him. 21-2 is his record. 3 wins in a row. 31 years of age, fighting out of Elevation. And let's look at his recent fights. So obviously Tony Ferguson this weekend, and was supposed to fight Tony Ferguson a couple of weeks ago as well. Before that, fought Donald Cerrone as well, and won via first round knockout. Edson Barboza before that knocked him out as well viciously, and knocked James Vick out before that viciously as well. And those 3 wins, I think, are probably the biggest 3 wins in terms of Justin Gaethje's adjustment to the very top level. Because we'll see before that, okay, the cancel bout versus Ali Quinta, but he had the Dustin Poirier and Eddie Alvarez fights as well, and 2 losses in those. And he adjusted his game after that, and now he's finishing guys early with big power. Guys at the top level, James Vick, who's a rising star at the time, 13-1. Edson Barboza, we know what Edson Barboza is like, and we know what Donald Cerrone is like as well. So 3 good wins there. to kind of get back after losing to Dustin Poirier, who went on to win the interim title after that. And Eddie Alvarez, obviously the former UFC lightweight champion of the world, beat Michael Johnson before that, and that was his first UFC fight. Previous to that, he'd been in World Series of Fighting, where he was 17-0. He beat Luis Firmino, Brian Foster, Luis Palomino on 2 extraordinary fights, especially the first one. Beat Melvin Gillard, Nick Newell before that. And you see his record here as well before that. Lots of guys in PFL and on his way up to PFL as well. So a very impressive record for both guys there. So let's look at the co-main event, Henry Cejudo versus Dominick Cruz. And let me look at Dominick Cruz first, because I think Dominick Cruz's record is really the story of how this fight might go. Cruz, obviously 35 years of age. Dominick Cruz is younger than Tony Ferguson. That's a good useless fact I might come up with. He's 22-2, and he lost his last fight. And look here, last fight, December 30th, 2016. Fighting out of Alliance MMA. And let's just look at that last fight and see who it was and where it was. So it was Cody Garbrandt, as I mentioned, all the way back in December 2016. So that's just over 3 years, 3.5 years now at this stage. That is a long time to be out. And we'll get to his previous long time out of the cage before that as well. So he was supposed to come back in 2017 and fight Jimmy Rivera. It was supposed to come back in 2019 and fight John Lineker, but both of those fights were scrapped through injury as well. Before that, he fought Uriah Faber in 2016, fought TJ Dillashaw in 2016 to win the title, and fought Takeya Mizugaki in 2014. So that was another gap there, and there's a big gap before that as well, which we'll get to. So he came back, beat TJ Dillashaw for the title, fight Uriah Faber, beat him as well, 2 decisions there, and then lost the decision to Cody Garbrandt. So in his last 3 fights, he's had 15 rounds in there. So that's still a lot under the belt in the last few years. But I'm sure he would have rathered more as well. Takeya Mizugaki, as I mentioned, 2 years before that, and then we look before that. So that was 2014. It was 2011 was the last time he fought before that. So there was 3 years out there, and then another 2 years, and now another 4 years out of the cage as well. So that's a lot of time for anyone to be out. Before that's all the way back to the Demetrius Johnson fight, the other Uriah Faber fight before that, and then Scott Jorgensen over in WEC. So how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fights in the UFC is all Dominick Cruz has had in 9 years. That's not very much. So that really is the story for Dominick Cruz, and it always has been for a long part of his career, but it's really the story of this fight as well. How will Dominick Cruz look coming back here? But there's no question Dominick Cruz has some fantastic wins. He's a win over the greatest of all time, Demetrius Johnson. We'll go down through his record. Uriah Faber, Scott Jorgensen, Joseph Benavidez, who was one of the best around for years and years and years. He beat him twice. Beat Ian McCall, who was the best 125-pounder in the world at the time. Lost to Uriah Faber early, Shad Smith, Joanne Miranda even, and the earlier fights here in his career as we can see. So let's look at the way Dominick Cruz wins these fights. As we see here, 7 by KO TKO, 1 by submission, 14 by decision, and his losses are all by decision. Oh no, he's 1 submission. So yeah, 3 Uriah Faber early in his career. So that's Dominick Cruz. Let's look at Henry Cejudo. He's 15-2, as we know, came into MMA as Olympic gold medalist, as we see here, that picture. He's currently 5 wins in a row, 33 years of age. His last fight was in June 2019, and he's fighting out of California as well. So let's look at Henry Cejudo's last few fights. He was supposed to fight Jose Aldo on this card, this card that was supposed to happen in April, but didn't manage to happen. And now fights Dominick Cruz coming back. Before that, he fought Marlon Moraes in a fight which he had to show great heart in to come back and win in the 3rd round there. Before that, he knocked out TJ Dillashaw very, very quickly in his move up to 135 pounds. Fought Demetrius Johnson and beat him in a very close, contentious split decision before that. And when you beat the greatest of all time, even if it is a little bit of a robbery or if it was a close decision or whatever, it's to even get close to someone that good is unbelievable. Before that, beating Sergio Pettis, beating Wilson Hayes in a clinic kind of and that was after those 2 losses, to Joseph Benavidez and Demetrius Johnson. So to come back from that, like I talked about, Gaethje, was huge and improve your game. That's what makes champions like this, and to become a 2-way champion after that was absolutely huge for him as well. Good wins before that: Juicy Formiga, Chico Camus, Chris Carriasso, who fought for the title, Dustin Kimura, and then you see his pre-UFC career. Look at all those cancelled bouts. He's had awful problems with weight and injuries before coming to the UFC. Missed weight, or was close to missing weight anyway, a couple of times. Fighting in legacy and building his way up. So we see all of those wins there as well. So how does Henry Cejudo win his fights? His wins: 6 wins by KO, TKO, 1 by submission, and 8 by decision. Is there 1 by submission? I looked it up today, and where's the 1 by submission? Is I don't know. Maybe there is. I don't know. I looked up Wikipedia there and it said he didn't, so I don't know. Anyway, and his losses: 1 by KO, TKO, and 1 by decision. So yeah, that's that fight. And we'll go back and we'll look at those 2 fights again just quick before we move on to the other ones. I won't do as much of a full breakdown of the other ones, but we'll have a quick look at them as well. So Ferguson Gaethje in the main event, 155-pound interim title. Henry Cejudo, Dominick Cruz for the 135-pound bantamweight title. Then Francis Ngannou versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Francis Ngannou 13-4, Jairzinho Rozenstruik 10-0. Let me just look quickly at Jairzinho's last few wins, because I think they really tell the story of kind of where he's come from and so quickly. So he's beaten Alistair Overeem and Andrei Arlovski in his last 2. And when did he make his debut? Like, he made his debut, 2012, but then he'd 5 years off and didn't fight again until 2017. So really, he's only been fighting for 2.5, 3 years. He had those 2 early fights against the same guy. I'm not sure what the crack with that was, but he hasn't been around that long. Fought a couple of times and risen over in Suriname as well. And then came into the UFC, beat Junior Albini, Alan Crowder, Andrei Arlovski, Alistair Overeem, and now he's here. And you look at Francis Ngannou then, and like, there's no need even to look at how these lads win their fights. We know how they win their fights. It's via knockout. Junior Santos, Cain Velasquez, Curtis Blades, his last 3 wins in a row. That is very, very good, and that is huge for a guy as well. It seems to be a team on this card. He lost 2 fights before that. Derek Lewis, Stipe Miocic. That obviously one of the worst fights of all time against Derek Lewis, and then he kind of got showed up against Stipe Miocic, and he's gone back and he's learned his craft again, and won the fights that he needed to win to get back to where he is today. Like Rozenstruik beat Alistair Overeem and Andrei Arlovski as well before that. So that's that fight. Huge fight. Someone's getting knocked out basically in that fight. Jeremy Stephens versus Calvin Kattar. We see after that Greg Hardy versus Jurgen De Castro. Donald Cerrone versus Anthony Pettis. Let's have a look at Donald Cerrone. Someone asked on the podcast this weekend, could this be maybe a last chance saloon for Donald Cerrone in the UFC? Unlikely, I'd say, but if you look at his record, okay, this is what his 50th fight, if I'm not mistaken. 51st fight. He's lost his last 3. Conor McGregor knocked him out, obviously, as we know, in 40 seconds. Justin Gaethje knocked him out in a round. Tony Ferguson was on his way to knocking him out when that fight ended at the end of the second. Beat Al Iaquinta, very good win before that. Beat Alexander Hernandez, another very good win. And beat Mike Perry as well before that. We'd be all day going through Donald Cerrone's record, but Leon Edwards lost to him. We look at some of his good wins. Beat Matt Brown, beat Rick Story, Patrick Cote, John McDessie, Benson Henderson, former champion of the world, Eddie Alvarez, former champion of the world, Edson Barboza, fantastic win there. Jeremy Stephens, Charles Oliveira. Look at all these fights and all these wins and all these losses. Had an awful lot of them, even early in his career, fighting Anthony and Giovanni, a dangerous striker. So lots and lots and lots of fights there for Donald Cerrone. And for Anthony Pettis as well. Not as many, 32 fights, but still a really experienced guy. His last few fights as well have been losses. Lost to Diego Ferreira, lost to Nate Diaz, beat Steve Wonderboy Thompson with that fantastic Showtime punch off the cage. Lost to Tony Ferguson before that as well. We see here beating Michael Chiesa, lost to Dustin Poirier. Fought Max Holloway, obviously lost his title to Rafael Dos Anjos, beat Benson Henderson, Gilbert Melendez before that, Don Cerrone, Joe Lozon. Look at all these wins. Benson Henderson again, back in his WEC career. And I think it's actually interesting. We'll go down and look at the way Anthony Pettis wins these fights. And maybe this will shock some people, but 8 by KO, and 10 by submission. So he's more submission wins than he has KO wins. So that's Anthony Pettis is very good on the ground. He gets taken down an awful lot, pushed against the cage an awful lot, but he's good guillotines and stuff like that. So that's an interesting thing to watch with Anthony Pettis. Fabricio Werdum versus Alexi Olynyk. Again, two submission wizards here. Werdum, let me just look at Werdum, see how long he's been out, because he got that USADA ban. So when was the last fight he had? Last fight he had was in 2018, so 2 years out of the cage. It'll be interesting to see what he looks like here coming against Alexi Olynyk, who has, look at all those fights, 58-13-1, so that's a big record for him there. Carla Esparza, former champion of the world, coming in against Michelle Waterson. You know, whoever wins this fight will probably be 1 or 2 fights away from getting to the very top again, so it's a big turning point fight, I think, for both of them. Ronaldo Jacare Souza against Uriah Hall, as we, you know, the striker versus grappler, as we'd probably call it down through the years. Vicente Luque and Nico Price, 17-7-1. Vicente Luque versus Nico Price, 14-3. Both guys been fighting well, maybe not winning all their fights recently, but fighting very well, both of them. And maybe on the, we see Vicente Luque here 12 on Tapology and Nico Price 25, so not too far away from it. Charles Rosa, Bryce Mitchell 12-0, he's way up, and Charles Rosa always exciting and pulls wins out of the bags maybe you don't expect him to get. And then Ryan Spohn versus Sam Alvey as well there. Right, so that's it. Thanks everybody for listening. Really appreciate it and watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe here on YouTube. Go over and subscribe as well to our podcast, the SevereMMA podcast. If you look it up on all your podcast apps or SevereMMA.com, you will find it there. Enjoy the fights this weekend. Stay safe and see you next time.